All right, here's your icebreaker question to get you started for today. Who or what do you trust for your news? Who or what do you trust as your source of news? Talk about that, and we'll get started with the Bible study in just a moment. So we're starting a new letter at this point. The letter is to the Hebrews, which means that it's written to a Jewish audience, or probably more appropriately, to Christ followers, Christians, who came from a Jewish background. It's clearly a letter that is written to encourage them in their faith and to help them to understand how their Jewish heritage and the Old Testament fits together with what we now understand because of Jesus. And so as you start to dive into this, what you're going to find is that it just jumps in from the very beginning, talking about the Old Testament and talking about how the prophets spoke to us as messengers from God in the Old Testament. And then he goes directly from there into comparing the Old Testament to what we now know about God and God's plan that is told to us through Jesus. And so he compares right off the bat. He says that in the olden days, the days before them, God used to speak to us through the prophets, but now God speaks to us through the Son. And there's a whole section that starts talking about the Son, God's Son, Jesus. There are a lot of Old Testament passage quotes that are going on in this little section here. And so I'm going to have you read them all at one time. And in them you will see that God's Son is compared to prophets, and God's Son is compared to angels. And so I'd just like for you to read that and then talk about the comparison. How does God's Son compare to the prophets and to the angels according to this passage? Talk about that with your group, and when you're ready to continue, you can press play. I asked about your who you trust or what you trust for your news in the opening question. It wasn't because I was trying to stir up trouble. It was because this passage is really all about that. It is talking about not what we trust, but who we trust. And that we could trust the prophets of the Old Testament to be spokespeople for God, that God confirmed with signs and miracles that they were in fact speaking on behalf of God as God's prophets. Now we see God's Son that is confirmed by God as speaking on behalf of God. In fact, on the passage that you just read there, we see that God's Son is not only the Son of God, but God in the flesh, if you go back and reread those passages. And so they are a reliable source of God's perspective. All of that has been compiled now into the Bible. The Old Testament is the words of the prophets that are written down. We have in the New Testament the teachings of Jesus that we see in the Gospels, and then being spread by the apostles and his other disciples that followed him. And now all of that is captured in the pages of the New Testament, and everything is compiled together in what we call the Bible. The important thing about all of this is that it is reliable, that this is communication from God. This is a good source for our news. And what God is trying to communicate is what the writer calls a great salvation. I'd like you to read this last passage and then talk about that. What is it that God is trying to communicate to us through the prophets and then now through Jesus? and then go to your prayer time and talk about at the prayer time how we can be people who trust the Son, trust Jesus, and follow what He has communicated to us to follow. Know that I'm praying for you, that I'm praying that all of us will be reliable and consistent in our following of the Son, of Jesus. God bless.